On March 26, 2000, Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation for the first time, winning in the first round of the early elections. At that time, almost 52% of voters cast their ballots for him. During his inauguration, he promised to work openly and honestly, to fight corruption, to ensure strong economic growth and the well being of citizens, to lower taxes, and also to become a guarantor of freedom of speech and democratic reforms. There is a huge gap between Putin's Russia of the 2000s and Putin's Russia today. Along with the country, of course, the man who over these years monopolized power and brought all state institutions under his control was also changing. It's even hard to imagine now that there was a time when the Western press called Putin a democratic leader. But he showed his true colors very quickly, and soon the headlines were using other descriptions: unscrupulous politician, usurper, bloody dictator. And then another transformation happened. More and more, the Russian leader started to be labeled as unreliable, weak, and even pathetic. For example, here's an illustration for an article in the respected Swiss publication Neue Title. Analyst Andreas Reusch gives a detailed account of how Russia, which tried to present itself as a great power, actually ended up with a string of humiliating failures around the world. In his view, the Kremlin's main and fatal mistake was the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
What the Kremlin intended as a triumphant blitzkrieg has turned into a complete nightmare, and not just for Ukrainians, but for the aggressors as well. 4 years later, Russian troops are raising flags over small villages in eastern Ukraine, hundreds of kilometers from their original objectives. Russia spreads fear, but fear is not the same as influence. This country has not gained prestige or global influence. The result is exactly the opposite. Russia has become weaker than it was before the war began. Andreas Reusch, political analyst, in a column for Neue Zeitung.
This month, this so-called spontaneous poll by the All-Russian Center for the Study of Public Opinion was published, showing a record low approval rating for Putin in all his years in power. The results indicate that only 32% of respondents trust the Kremlin dictator, which is just over a third. United Russia also set an anti-record for public support. 6 months before the elections, only 31% of voters are ready to cast their ballots for him. By the way, you won't find this poll on the official website of VTS-IOM anymore. It was taken down very quickly. Interestingly, the same thing happened with the draft version of Putin's International Women's Day greeting. The video where he coughs and stumbles over his words was also, supposedly by accident, posted online and then quickly deleted. By the way, many people believe this was done deliberately to undermine the dictator's authority.
These two news events, the embarrassing video and the poll results, could only have been orchestrated administratively at the very top. For example, by someone like Kiriyenko, or for a lot of money from some oligarchs. In any case, it looks like the Russian elite is throwing Putin under the bus. On one hand, they embarrassed him in front of the public, making him look weak, old, and sick. On the other, they showed that his approval rating is nowhere near as high as it used to be and keeps dropping. All of this looks like an information campaign preparing for a change in the regime's course. Igor Eidman, sociologist, from a Facebook post.
By the way, speaking of the oligarchs' big money, on March 26th, Putin held a closed-door meeting with industrialists and entrepreneurs where he demanded that they chip in for the war in Ukraine. At the same time, the Kremlin dictator made it clear that there are no plans to stop the fighting, and no one is seriously going to negotiate for peace. Over the years of Putin's rule, most of Russia's oligarchs have long since become his silent accomplices. And of course, they'll be forced to pay up. Despite rising interest rates, a sharp economic slowdown, and most industrial sectors sliding into recession, the system Putin has built over 26 years operates simply and harshly. Either you play by the Kremlin's rules and fund its decisions, or you risk losing everything.
Right after the Congress of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, Vladimir Putin held a closed-door meeting with major businessmen. The content of such meetings is usually not disclosed, and since the start of the war, even the list of participants has been classified. According to one source, the idea to shake down business during a difficult time for the country came from the head of Rosneft, Igor Sechin, who had outlined it in a letter to Vladimir Putin the day before. As a mechanism for raising funds, the letter proposed issuing war bonds. From a publication by The Bell.
The situation at the front, despite all the Kremlin's loud statements, is rapidly deteriorating for Russians. Against the backdrop of successful counterattacks by Ukraine's defense forces and the failure to prepare for the summer offensive, even Russia's so-called war correspondents have started criticizing the military command and talking about systemic problems. Complaints about the tactics of small groups, poor training, and the dominance of Ukrainian drones are being voiced more and more often. At the same time, no one in Russia has believed the official reports for a long time. Let us recall that from August to December 2025, the authorities of the Russian Federation reported more than a dozen times about the capture of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region, about controlling the city or clearing it. These claims were made by the chief of the general staff, the minister of defense, the foreign ministry several times, and even Putin himself. It's no surprise that with each of these reports, the Russian leadership looks more and more incompetent.
Military bloggers claim that it will take Russian forces about 100 years to capture the rest of Ukraine, which is similar to the estimate from the Institute for the Study of War, according to which Russian forces would need 83 years to take over the rest of the country. These statements may be a last attempt to criticize the Russian military command before the Kremlin imposes the expected ban on Telegram and moves military bloggers to state-controlled platforms. From the Institute for the Study of War report.
Among other things, the Kremlin has also proven to be a useless ally. This is another conclusion that the entire global community has reached since the start of the operation in Iran. In just 1 year, Putin has lost 3 of his closest friends: Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and Ali Khamenei in Iran. And he didn't help any of them. In the past, Russia was seen as a geopolitical player whose position was taken into account. But now, against the backdrop of a prolonged war against Ukraine, both Moscow's resources and its influence are visibly dwindling. However, it's also dangerous to underestimate a war criminal. As British Prime Minister Keir Starmer stated at the Joint Expeditionary Force Summit in Helsinki, Russia is not capable of winning the war against Ukraine, but the threat posed by the aggressor country has not disappeared.
The threat from Russia in the north and east still remains, and that's why it's important that we're speaking openly about it here. In fact, this threat has even grown. And we all know very well what kind of impact it has on our security, our economy, and the cost of living for our families. Putin is rubbing his hands together, recalling the Gulf War and the rise in oil prices. And that's exactly why, in my view, we need to fight the shadow fleet even more actively. Together, we must block the most important sea routes to keep up the pressure on Putin and help change the course of this war.
In 26 years in power, Putin has step by step made decisions that ultimately weakened both the country and his own position. Mistakes in foreign policy, relying on force instead of diplomacy, and the war against Ukraine have led to a loss of influence and Russia's isolation. The Kremlin is losing allies, resources, and trust both inside the country and abroad. Today, Russia is paying a high price for the decisions made by its leadership. And judging by all appearances, this process is already becoming irreversible.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.